Am I here or where am I going to be?
I have no idea. I don't think so. I don't think so.
I don't know. One of the panelists, so I guess I'm there. Well, it's funny because one of the things I wanted to ask about was, it's a longer conversation, but I kind of need to know how I'm getting into the country now that we're supposedly out of it. I've got a friend who's flying C-130s, and he's telling me that they're flying into Baghdad all the time.
If you can get on a military flight, that would be great, but I think you're still having a visa problem.
The visa issue. I have to go through. How are they to work with? As difficult as they were before they got overthrown?
Well, I mean, I wasn't there prior to 2003, but in the last few years, the U.S. military
Well, you know, a friend of mine, Carl Pine, went in there without a visa.
Really?
Yeah,
I mean,
they were looking for him.
It's a real shame. The stars are
Hey, Leo.
Haven't run into you in a while.
Since we were in touch.
Yeah, I think that was last time I saw you. So how you doing?
Since then, I've been to Afghanistan.
I think when I was coming around, they sent me. No, I didn't. I think that was the last trip I went. After that, I had another one that took me to rotation for a while. So I was happy to do it. So.
Oh, that's the damnedest thing. That's true.
Yes, I.
That was a disaster.
No, it worked out well. No, it worked out. My buddy, the pilot, and I were arguing at one point.
Yeah, I think that's the point where I remember crossing paths with you.
Something I call war journalist, which I copied across on my disk on there.
Okay.
He hasn't called or said anything.
See, I gotta get better people. I gotta get better people that make bets because I won 20
Oh, you don't want this anymore?
That was part of the side.
And then if you
I want to get it out of the trash. How do you get it out of the trash?
to pull it out,
No, once then can you delete it on trash?
yes, yeah, because unless you do that, it's not ever completely gone. So you have to right click, which on a Mac it's Control click, and then
Somebody did a real nice
empty
job. I
trash.
think it was the side.
But maybe there's other things that trash is just what ends.
Where you just
Yeah,
wrote
I
one,
don't
it's like,
know.
look,
So
the only way that you can explain to me is
just double click on it.
system amount of people.
There's going to be something I call war journalist.
Should be, it's
This is what the numbers are. I'm not rooting on the
set up
system.
as
My friend was always telling me the dinosaur was when he's
alphabetical. So should be down at the bottom somewhere.
I was surprised at the number of people who were stunned by the result. Really building indictment against everything that
So you can even just delete it from here now. Well, you have to hit empty trash, so and it might delete everything. So, yeah, so I would just leave it in there for now, and when she's ready to delete her trash, she'll get rid of it.
Alright, she's a respectable lady, she's not going to play around with my trash.
I read your book, by the way, about a year and a half ago. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much.
I was just
My name is Julie Jacobson with AP.
Nice to meet you.
Yes.
You've been through the study now at AP.
Probably. In fact, Santiago Ryan gave me a book to read, suggested.
This is a 2-hour ride. What did I volunteer?
One of your case studies, I believe. No, he was. Yes. He told me he was. He said he was one of the anonymous stories, so not to ruin his
career.
Yes.
Hell of a nice guy.
Put it off for an hour and wasn't Ben taking off.
Are you a photographer?
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
You still go to bad places? Or?
I haven't been back in a couple of years.
take my spot here. I'll catch you after.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
enough times.
There's no shortage of places to go to. Is there?
No, definitely not.
I'm in a bad spot. Someone's gonna be, I'm in a bad spot.
That's where you belong.
Do it immediately.
Unless you want to be
You
front
know,
and
I
center.
went to a company called Visa Advisors.
Yeah, you're on the
They mucked it
panel.
up
Why
so
don't you
bad
sit
that
right
I
over
was
there?
There's like 6 of
novel
us.
that I stopped using it.
Why wouldn't you just go to the embassy?
In fact, I have a question for you later about the whole dopamine thing. It's very interesting. Yeah.
And I don't have time to go to the embassy. Usually, it's if you hire somebody, you just get them to do it. But the company I used was, we had a near disaster when I went with Mullen on his round the world
Well, we need one more.
tour.
Yeah, but
I just didn't get my visa. I didn't get my passport. We'll be cool. Last day.
We got this.
when you go to
Well,
the plane,
Mullen's people handle it, but I had already given it to Visa Advisors, which was a company here in town to do. And so they really screwed it up. It got stuck somewhere and nobody got it out for like 3 weeks.
it's really odd. When I used to travel with the chairman or whatever,
Their office
the
does.
OSD would just do it.
And see, I had never dealt with them before, so I didn't know that they were going to do that. And so I took their and then they said, oh well, and it was too late. And I didn't even know where the visa was. And this dude that was doing the work for us, he was the stuff. Just never telling the truth. And we're all sitting there saying, what is going on with this passport? And then the Indians had it, and the Indians were destroyed. I had to get a certified birth certificate.
Unless anybody thinks they're going to need
And then the
power.
PACs had it.
Maybe I'll just,
Well, we stopped in both places. Why one after the other?
yeah, that's a good idea, Tom. Let's see if I can actually do that.
Or through the bottom, right there.
Yeah.
Never even thought of having a second passport.
I can get a second passport.
Really?
I mean, do you ever travel?
No.
Okay,
I know
let's
that
go
was-
ahead and get started again.
Really?
I think we're missing one panelist. If Susanna's here, chair. So,
Somebody
okay.
somebody actually pulled some strings to get that.
For sure up there.
It didn't
Okay,
look like
yeah,
a
she-
Grab his chair. We'll put Luger here if he's.
No, you can stay here if you want, so.
Okay, everybody, be friendly. But no PTSD.
Yes, she's going to stay, and she'll be fine.
Yeah,
Okay,
we'll be over there.
yeah, we'll be fine.
Because they've got that one over there. So.
Okay. Sorry, Tom. All right, just a couple of quick things, housekeeping kind of details. This afternoon's panel is long, and we designed it that way deliberately because we thought it'd give everybody a chance to interact and a chance for you all to ask questions of other journalists. If we finish early, that's great. Just keep in mind there's a reception at 5:30 in the Holman Room, which is right across the Marble Walkway. You'll see KU alums there because we're combining two things. So if people are walking around hugging each other saying Rock Chalk Jayhawk, don't be alarmed, okay? We'll fill you in on what that means. I've been informed that we have some leftover notebooks and pens. Take them with you because we don't want to take them home. And when we win the basketball championship, you will want this, and you won't have it. So, and they'll be selling on eBay for a lot of money. So you want to be sure. Okay. We're really lucky this afternoon because we were able to put together a panel of journalists, and Dr. Feinstein's going to stay with us, who are going to talk about their experiences covering post-traumatic stress disorder or covering trauma, but also their experiences in coping with it themselves. So I'm not going to talk very much. We have questions. We'll do the same format where we'll let them talk, we'll moderate, but then we'll have a lot more chances for you all to interact. And if any of the panelists from the earlier sessions are here, you can ask them questions as well. But I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their experiences or their interest in covering trauma, and then, like I said, we'll do a moderated panel and we'll have plenty of chances for you all to ask questions. And again, everything's on the record, just keep it in mind. Okay, and why don't we start, let's start with Mark.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I want to thank Barbara, and I do have a few remarks that I've written down. So after meeting Jackie, even though we've been in correspondence for quite a while, and Anthony, we've been in correspondence for several years, and I met Julie today, I can honestly say I'm probably the least impressive of the panel members. That doesn't mean I don't have a strong ego, but this is definitely a very impressive group. And even in my own family, my wife is a domestic violence caseworker, so even in my own home, I am the least impressive of the two. So, but and I'm a little different than the rest of the group, with the exception of Dr. Feinstein, and that is, unlike my colleagues, I am not, nor have I been, a war correspondent. I haven't covered conflict or combat, nor have I borne witness to tragedy and trauma. I became involved in this issue not as a trauma journalist, but as a longtime freelancer and a narrative nonfiction author who chose to spend 6 years documenting the work of some of these brave men and women who have served their profession and who have often paid a significant price for their coverage of war, disaster, and death, a toll largely invisible to their audiences. I wrote my book, Trauma Journalism on Deadline in Harm's Way, because I believed in the words of the playwright Arthur Miller in the play Death of a Salesman, that attention must finally be paid. And isn't it that the reason why we're here today, and that we have a shared belief that this attention to this issue of trauma in journalism will benefit people, not only those of us in the profession, but students and future journalists. In writing my book, I've tried to personalize what I and others consider a media movement, with in-depth profiles of reporters, researchers, and trauma experts engaged in an international effort to transform how journalists work under demanding conditions. As I noted in the preface of my book, when I first embarked on this journey to write about trauma journalism, I received a blunt response from an East Coast literary agent who said, "I suspect that there's little concern by John Q. Public for the emotional and psychological impact of traumatic news events on journalists." Undeterred, I continued my research and reporting, motivated by the accounts of journalists worldwide, men and women who put themselves at risk physically and psychologically so others could be informed. Further, I was drawn to reform efforts underway within the news media to challenge traditional practices and precepts. And I was inspired by the many journalists who were willing to share their accounts of the emotional impact of their work. I was also encouraged by the efforts of organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and the International News Safety Institute to raise awareness and advocate for change at a time of devastating economic conditions and upheaval in the newsrooms worldwide. Despite these challenges, I believe change is coming to the news media. Forums such as this workshop today are a reflection of this change, of a consciousness raising, and of institutional reform. And unlike that cynical literary agent who tried but failed to discourage me years ago, I believe that people do care and will care about the impact of traumatic events and hazardous coverage on journalists, their sources, and on news consumers. Attention must finally be paid.
Hi, do I have to turn this on? I'm Jackie Spinner. I don't have any prepared remarks because I'm a war correspondent and a risk taker. So I'm just going to wing it. Tell you who I am. I was with the Washington Post for 14 years. Since 2004 to 2009, I was a foreign correspondent and a war correspondent. I am now an assistant professor of journalism at Columbia College in Chicago. And thank you, Dean Burnett, for inviting me to be part of the panel.
Thank you. I think you've heard enough of my voice already. I'm Anthony Feinstein.
Thanks. My name is Laura Jakes. I am a national security writer for the Associated Press. I left Iraq last month after living for 3 years in Baghdad, the third and final as the bureau chief. I oversaw a staff of 65 Iraqis. I was the only expat this last year in Baghdad for the Associated Press, which was different from how AP has functioned in Iraq since the invasion in 2003. We did not live in the Green Zone or on a military base. We lived in an Iraqi neighborhood. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them that, but that's how journalists live. We try to live among the people that we cover. I have a couple of just quick thoughts that I wanted to run down. I want you all to know that I volunteered to go to Iraq. I wanted to go. It was actually a very competitive job process. And I loved living there, even though it was very hard at times. It's a very tough life. I don't know if I have PTSD, and I haven't really covered PTS extensively, except through just the people that I've interviewed, and I would say the military people I've interviewed, and also the Iraqis. Because when you live in a war zone, you will have some kind of, it's a traumatic thing. I mean, people, whether you're Iraqi, whether you're a journalist, or whether you're a soldier, you will suffer, or, sorry, I guess from the last panel, or the panel a couple times ago, I need to rephrase that. People who live in war zones feel some traumatic effects. I think that's unavoidable, and I think that's just obvious. I think that as journalists, we need to know when to ask for help. And I think that our news organizations need to make it clear that we will not be penalized if we ask for help, either in being reassigned or being ripped out of your current assignment or your current posting, or even to lose your job totally. And we all know in this environment and the market, it's not a great time. But I think that we do need to know when to ask for help. And I think that we need to be assessed when we come back, much in the way that the military is assessed. Otherwise, we just kind of float along and try and reintegrate, and that's hard. If our news organizations don't take the lead on that, who will? And for some of us, it's very hard to seek help. So I think the news organizations need to be responsible and do that. Because, when it comes down to it, our job is to tell the story fairly and accurately, but also clearly. And we all know you can't really do that if your head's kind of still stuck in the fog of war. So I'm happy to take your questions, and thank you for including me on this panel. I think it's a very important topic.
Wow. Well, I'm Sig Christensen. I'm a military writer for the San Antonio Express News, and I guess in some ways the de facto military writer for the Hearst chain, because I don't think we've got anyone doing it anymore at all. I've been overseas probably over 10 or 11 times now, and been to Iraq 6 times and Afghanistan twice. Seen a good deal of combat, both as an embed and as a reporter working independently of the military. Over the years, I think the work led me to see things in other people that I then saw in myself. You put 2 and 2 together pretty quickly, and you can kind of figure out what your issues are. So when I came back from the invasion, my then wife and I had a conversation, and she said, "You haven't talked about anything that happened." And I said, "You wouldn't understand." Now, that maybe wasn't nice, but I think it's kind of symptomatic of what people who come back from the war zone think and feel. They feel a little isolated. You come back to your newsroom, nobody really has any sense of what you're going through. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought you should write about that subject. There are a lot of soldiers in Texas, a lot of airmen. Fort Sam Houston is a big medic training facility, so you got people with a lot of war zone experience coming and going. And so I started focusing on soldier and family stress issues, and later, after I saw Pauline Jelinek writing about it in AP, I started writing about suicides, and I've written way too much about that. I think post-traumatic stress issues, TBI, all the issues that have been coming out the last couple of years are probably the biggest issues of the war. They'll reverberate for at least another generation. I've got a stepson that I was with in Iraq, and that kid has gone to Iraq 4 times, and he's got 5 kids. And they've lived through, a couple of those kids have lived through the entire war. What are they going to be like? I get a little worried about it. And if I had to summarize it, the things that I think I've lived and felt are things that I should be writing about. I don't want to say I'm leveraging it. I'm just trying to give people a sense of what, since they haven't gone, and most people haven't, it's giving people a sense of what people are going through who are in the military and who often have repeated tours, what their families are going through, and that probably is my principal line of work now, if I can ever quit writing about Lackland, which would be wonderful. Anyway, I'm happy to take your questions, and thank you for having me, too.
Thanks, Steve. Julie?
Bring the microphone. Okay.
I'm Julie.
It should be on.
He'll turn it up. It's okay. Go ahead. Go.
I'm Julie. Julie Jacobson. I'm a photographer for the Associated Press. I spent time in Iraq initially during the invasion and then a little bit thereafter, and then went to Afghanistan in the 2009, 2010 time frame. I haven't been back for a couple of years, but I do definitely have an interest in covering, or at least doing stories on PTSD, especially having probably experienced some, symptoms myself. I wouldn't say it's been a disorder, but when you go to conflict zones, you suddenly realize that some of the things you experience, you suddenly realize that, gosh, what is it like for a military person to be over there for an entire year or longer? And then you take your experiences coming home, and you take it and you go, hey, I guess, I'm losing my relationships with people. I don't relate to people very well. What's it like for a military person to come home to their family and their children, especially the kids? And my interest, especially coming to this workshop, was kind of to learn from other people's experience, to learn, how to ask questions, topics we need to address, and as well to inform some of you on, how to approach us, how to approach military, the things, just as he said, the things that we go through, how to support each other. Like one of the questions I saw on the list here is, what can management do? And I don't think they've even asked themselves that enough. So I'm going to pass it along to you.
Okay. All right. I'm Susanna Neesmith. I'm currently a freelance journalist, but I was my war was Colombia. I spent 2 years working for the AP in Colombia. I also did a tour in Iraq, but if you want to know about Iraq, Laura and Jackie can tell you a lot more about it than I can. I was only there for 6 weeks. I also spent some time in Haiti. And in a lot of ways, my most traumatic deployment was to New Orleans after Katrina. It hit me in a very different way because it was home. And one of the comforts of covering a war for a journalist is we can go home. Katrina was very upsetting because it was different in that way. So, and I'm also very happy to be here. I think it's an important topic.
Okay, thank you all very much. Let me just start out by asking kind of a general question, because some of you, when we were getting ready for this conference, we talked about how did you prepare yourself for covering trauma? Is there any way you can prepare yourself? So I'd like some thoughts on that, and I'm sure some of the journalists here would be interested to hear it too. So is there a way you can get ready? And Dr. Feinstein, you've done research, so you might have some ideas too. Or is it just something you have to live through and then react to? Julie?
My first time going to cover war was the invasion. I'd never done anything like that. I think the most traumatic things I'd covered were, car accidents, fires, there were victims. And maybe about a month or so before I was getting ready to embed, I thought to myself, wow, this is a war. This is totally different. And there was general fear. And once I got past, okay, I'm going to be afraid. But there was this gnawing question in my head that I was trying to get to, and the question was, well, what if I live through it? Then what? Am I prepared for change? Am I prepared to be a changed person when I get back? Because that's probably going to be, I think that's harder living through it than, I don't want to say dying. I mean, if I die, there's nothing I can do about it. But when you get home, a lot of the times I tell people the hardest part about going to war is not being there. It's the coming home. I can, as long as I live through the war and I get it and I'm in it, I'm okay. But once I get home, it's the change that comes with it. And am I prepared to do the work to get through it? And that's one of the things you have to ask yourself, I think, if you decide you want to be a foreign correspondent covering conflict or tragedy anywhere in the world. That's probably the most basic thing I did for myself. Everything else was, physical in nature as far as prepping myself for the rigors of being out, you know, without the comforts of civilian life or anything like that. That was the easy stuff.
It's funny. I don't think anybody who's going for the first time has any idea what they're in for. When I went to Iraq, we went to Kuwait, and I'd been there before. I had actually been pretty clear that we were going to have a war for about a year, and I prepared as much as I could for it. But I was not in the best shape, let's say. I weighed about 40 pounds more than I should, and I was on a few prescriptions to keep me healthy, right? And it was funny because I'm on the bus, and I'm thinking about Ernie Pyle, and I'm saying, you know, somebody on this bus isn't coming home. It was the weirdest thought. And I looked around and I thought, well, that's probably going to be you because you're the one who's not in shape. It was David Bloom and Michael Kelly. So that was real. To this day, I'm not sure any of us knew what we were getting ourselves into. And after a while, you know, you just kind of got used to it. It became your job, your office. I preoccupied myself with producing stories, and I wrote a lot. And I had a strange realization one day at Najaf that, you know, this was like hunting season being open. Where you came from, it wasn't legal to kill. Now, not only was it legal, but people got medals for it. And so I felt like a deer. It takes a while to adjust to that. And then when you come back, you have a completely different set of adjustments. And it's like being a fish out of water. And so I don't know how you can prepare if you've never done it, although I would make a couple of suggestions. There's literature you can read. There are a lot of websites. Healing Combat Trauma is a great website. You can learn a lot about post-traumatic stress issues from that. You can talk to people before you go and after. So I emailed Joe Galloway before I went, and I said, Joe, tell me what to expect. Tell me what to do. Give me an idea of how to just stay alive. And he gave me some tips. When I got back, we met at Shelley's Tavern. And I said, Joe, I feel a little crazy. And he said, that's okay, son. You're supposed to feel that way. And so having someone to talk to is a really big deal. Having somebody who's been there and lived it, I think, is probably the single most important thing you can do for yourself. And once you get through that, at least you'll have a fighting chance of feeling normal again. But I don't know that you can prepare. I mean, you don't know what it's like until you're there, and it kind of is freaky. It freaks you out, to be honest. It just completely freaks you out to sit there and say, wow, I could die out here, they could shoot me, and yeah, that can happen in a split second.
On that happy note.
Sorry.
That's okay. You know, I think that most journalists who go to war zones, I think now most people take some kind of HEFAT training, which is first aid and hostile environment training. Certainly AP has all of its employees do that. And so, you know, you go and you learn how to do a tourniquet and to do all of this, and you hope that you remember it when you get to the place. And you hope you never need it, frankly. And I never did, just for the record, but I was glad that I had it. Obviously, you want to, as Sig said, talk to people, read as much about the current state of what's happening in the region that you're going to. But frankly, what I did, and these suggestions may seem kind of silly, but before I accepted the 3-year, or actually it was a 2-year posting in Baghdad, and then it extended for a third. But before I accepted the posting, I went for 6 weeks and just wanted to see what it was like, and wanted to actually just do the story. And so I had an idea when I came back of what I needed to have. And frankly, what I needed to have was some of my own stuff. I needed my books. I needed pictures of my family. I think AP even shipped over a couch that I'd had in my living room, just so I could have my own little, cozy cave to retreat to, my sanctuary, when things got bad and things, got stressful. There were some really stressful times, and you need to be able to go to a place where you can feel secure and homey, or you can just relax after a string of very tough days, because there's never really an easy day. And so maybe that sounds kind of silly, but it really did help me. I mean, even if it's a favorite DVD, I would, people eat comfort food. I read comfort books. So, I mean, I think I went through Memoirs of a Geisha. The thing's in tatters at this point. But also, to get me mentally prepared for it, there was a picture that one of our photographers had taken of me on one of my first Black Hawk rides. A Black Hawk is a helicopter. And man, if you've never taken a Black Hawk ride, it is the sexiest thing in the world. I mean, it is just so much fun. And so we were flying down south, and I was looking out the window, and a huge grin on my face, and wow, this is so much fun. I can't believe I'm getting paid for this, And so this photographer took this picture of me, and I really liked it because, I could look at it and I could say, wow, I'm really happy doing this. So when I moved back, I taped it onto my mirror because I knew there were going to be really hard days ahead. I knew that it wasn't going to be an adventure every day. I knew that it wasn't going to be fun most of the time. But I wanted to remind myself every day, hey, I asked for this. I wanted this. And those moments do still exist out here. So, it was kind of like put your big girl pants on and keep going kind of photo, because those moments do exist. You just have to kind of, shine on through the hard times to get to those times, the good ones.
I think that education is very important. I think that journalists should know about symptoms of post-traumatic stress. They should know about depression. They should know about substance abuse. I'm a huge fan of education. Once or twice a year, CNN asked me to come to speak to their foreign correspondents, just basically to educate them about what are the potential psychological risks. What I also tell journalists, and I didn't say it in my talk, was that I think journalists are very resilient. And although my talk focused on trauma, the overwhelming majority of journalists are not traumatized. I think it's a very important point to put across. The other thing that I think is essential is that news organizations need to be prepared as well. It's one thing to have a journalist educated, but news organizations should be educated. I have seen situations in which something's gone wrong in the field and a journalist has been killed, and there's been no mechanism at all in the newsroom to how to deal with it. And and then mistakes are made one after another, and situations are compounded, and what's clearly a tragedy gets magnified by so many missteps, and that increases the pressure on everybody. So I think there has to be a very clear strategy on the part of news organizations. If you're going to send someone into harm's way, you need to have a plan to deal with it. What happens if something goes wrong? How do you support someone in the field? How do you support their families back home? I mean, I think responsible news organizations think about these things in advance. Very difficult to think about them when a tragedy's happened, because then you're just kind of scrambling. So I think preparation is very important. But my understanding is that there's no way that you can cover every base. I mean, you can't control war, and there's no substitute for experience. But some good, sensible preparation beforehand is very helpful.
Jackie?
Well, I think I agree with Sig that I'm not sure a reporter actually asked me this question last week, how do you prepare for war? And I don't think you are prepared for PTSD or PTS. And I said, I don't think you can, because as Sig said, I don't know how one prepares, herself to see some of the same things that you see as a war correspondent. But I think for me, and what I advise people who come to talk to me who want to go overseas, is that you really have to check your motivations. I mean, why do you want to go? I wanted to go because that was where my story was taking me. I'm a journalist. I cover stories. I'm a storyteller, and the story was in Baghdad, and that's why I wanted to go. I didn't want to go to make a name for myself, to be on the front page day after day. I mean, that's not why I went. And I always got a little nervous talking to colleagues who were there to be famous or to do something extraordinary, or to move ahead in their newsroom. And I was probably fortunate because I was at the Washington Post, and I knew that failure for me meant just coming back to Washington and still being at the Washington Post. So I didn't probably have the same risk. But now that I talk a lot about war photography, because I direct a photography exhibit, and I go all over the country, and I talk to students a lot, and I show them a photo of Jawad Silva, who lost both legs in Afghanistan in the fall of 2010, shooting for the New York Times. And I show them a photo of Chris Hondros. And I do that, and no one ever knows who they are. I've been all over the country, and no student has ever recognized either one of them or their photographs, and they're two of probably the most celebrated war photographers of my generation. And I do that as a way to tell students that, you know, you can go and you can be famous and you can be dead. And I think it's very important to remember that and to make sure that you're going for the right reasons, and the reason for me was always the story. So.
Just briefly, following up on what Jackie said, the British journalists that I've interviewed who've been war correspondents have a term called suss it out. And basically it means don't try to be a hero. Know what you're doing there. Don't take excessive risks. And obviously go through some of the things that the panelists have already talked about, hostile environment training, and talk to as many other correspondents who have been there before you. But I think, as Jackie said, you really have to know your motivations before you go.
One of the differences that I have is I was able to go sort of slowly into war because Colombia was a very different kind of war. I lived in a very nice apartment and was very comfortable, and nobody threw bombs at me. And then I would periodically go into the jungle, into very dangerous places sometimes. But that, I think, helped prepare me a lot for working in both Haiti and Iraq, which were much more dangerous environments all the time. I don't know that many people can do it that way, but for me that was helpful.
I'd like to ask each of you to explore a little bit more about what management or your company, or however you want to phrase it, could do to help you prepare. A couple of you have touched on that, but I'd really like to hear maybe some more specifics. To prepare to go to war, to prepare for what, when you come back, you know, what was lacking?
Well, I think that it depends on the conflict and on the news organization. I mean, obviously, the larger news organizations have the money to spend on training and preparation. You know, when I went to Iraq, I had 7 days to get ready. I didn't go through the training that Laura described. There wasn't time for me to learn how to do any of that. I had to rely on my Girl Scout training, which is probably mediocre at best. But I didn't have time to train, and I don't think that was the fault of the Washington Post. I think it was the pace of the news. I think in Sig's case covering the invasion, there was obviously buildup. People were being trained because they knew something was going to happen. But I don't think that's always the case with conflict. That your news organizations have time to prepare journalists. I think the bigger problem is on the back end, when journalists are coming home. This is just my opinion. I don't represent the Washington Post when I say that. Nor is this a criticism necessarily of the Post. Although I think the Post, like other news organizations, in 2005, when I came home the first time, probably wasn't as prepared as they are now. I don't know. I'm not there anymore. But I think that is the bigger problem. It's not the preparation. It's the reaction to the journalist coming back into the newsroom. And how do you treat your correspondent? What kind of questions do you ask? What kind of help do you offer? I like what I keep hearing. Well, journalists are resilient, and the vast majority bounce back from these things. And then if you're a journalist who has some kind of reaction to trauma, that's exactly why you don't want to speak up in your newsroom. I mean, I had PTS symptoms, and now I'm sort of like, well, okay. Because the majority of people may not have those symptoms or have those issues. And so particularly if only 20% of the war correspondents are women, then now I'm speaking up as the woman, then the minority who is again in the minority, having had some kind of reaction to war. And that to me is the problem, is that how do you create an environment, in a very unforgiving environment, for journalists to feel like they can speak up and talk about the issues that they need to talk about, and to do the kind of work when they come home that is as meaningful to them as what they were doing overseas.
Specifically, I'm your editor, I'm a publisher or whatever. What do you want me to do? What do you want us to do? What kinds of questions I mean, specific questions.
Well, after I've spent 2 years covering Iraq and Afghanistan, and you sent me to the Battle of Fallujah, and I barely survived that, I don't want to go and cover the SEC when I come home. I mean, it's not gonna be fulfilling for me. I don't want to go into, the outer reaches of Washington as a suburban reporter covering schools. I mean, I want some understanding that what I did was important and valued, and that I'm going to need something fairly engaging. I mean, I was fortunate after I made that comment publicly. I was then covering the military for the Post. But, and I think I liked what Colonel Jason said on the panel this morning. There are not enough editors in the newsroom who have done this kind of conflict reporting who can pull you aside and, say what Joe said to him, which is like, look, you're going to be screwed up. Here's what you do and here's what you don't do. Don't go out and drink every night. Don't, get on a lot of medication. Just take it easy. Ease yourself back in the newsroom. We're not, or here's a couple of stories that will keep you engaged, so you're engaged because you've been working 14, 15 hours a day for 7 days a week for 2 years. So I think that it would have been helpful for me probably to have an editor who had covered the kind of conflict that I was covering, who would have taken me aside and had that sort of community. I don't think we have that community as journalists that the military has. And so I reached out to veterans, because those are the people who understood me, and those are the ones who helped me through. Most of my issues were resolved by veterans and not by people in my newsroom because I had no connection to them. But that's just my personal experience.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on
Turn
that.
the mic.
Oh. I'll follow up on that by saying, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I think a lot of editors and your colleagues in the newsroom are clueless. They're preoccupied. And they think, well, hell, if he went through a war, he must be tough or she must be tough. We don't have to worry about them. When I came back from Iraq, they offered all of us a chance me and the photographer, to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I visited with him for a while, and I felt like, well, okay, I'm pretty okay. I think Joe Galloway was a better psychiatrist for me in a lot of ways. You could drink with him. So I built in a couple of things from that trip. We took a week off, and we went to London, and we slept. I walked through Kensington Gardens. I read. I had to finish a special section that we were doing, and so I had to work some. But every trip I could, I took a week off, and I charged it to the company. They can handle it. And they later sent me to Centurion. They sent me and a photographer that I worked with a lot to Centurion. And I thought, well, I've already been there 3 times. This is kind of late in the game. And actually, the whole hostage-taking thing, when they did that, just freaked me out. So I almost wish I hadn't gone. The hood over the head part of that doesn't work too well if you've been in a war zone, I think. And so ultimately, I kind of think what you ought to do is if you have a chance to talk to your bosses about it, a smart, sympathetic boss, just one, raise the issue of having time off when you come home. That's big. If you don't have a beat, I think Jackie's dead right. You don't want to be covering the school board. You want to be doing something that matters to you. Probably something that you were just working on. I mean, if you're writing about troops, then write about troops for a while. And ultimately, I keep saying, find people that you know who've been there, whether they're soldiers or not, and talk to them, get to see them. You'll feel better around people that have been there and done it. It'll just help you a huge amount. It always did with me. And the only thing I'd add to this is that when I came back from one trip, I came back and my wife and I were getting divorced. I came home to an empty house. The dog was in the backyard, half dead. And I told a friend about this. She's the wife of an Apache pilot that I'm very good friends with. And she started laughing, and I said, "What's so funny?" And she said, "That's such an Army story." Well, I think that the civilian world in general just is not prepared to understand you. So you've got to find a way to help people understand you and to understand them. You've got to some degree, you've just got to figure that a lot of people aren't going to be there for you. You've got to do it yourself.
And I wanted to mention the Centurion class. I also went through it. The AP put me through it. And I've never had to use that stuff, but I think we are all safer in the field the more journalists that go through it because of the first aid training. All of the soldiers and sailors out there get much more first aid training than journalists do. And I am safer in Haiti or Iraq if I'm with Jackie and she knows how to do a tourniquet. So I think that is important training, even if you hope most of your people don't use it. I did watch, I'm afraid, on live television, a Colombian journalist who died because none of the AP reporters were anywhere nearby. And he bled out as they tried to get him down off a mountain after getting caught in a firefight. And he didn't need to. So I think the Centurion course or the other hostile environment courses just for their first aid training are very helpful. I don't think the kidnapping, how to get kidnapped thing was very helpful for me either. I thought it was stupid. But and in terms of after, Knight Ridder had a program where somebody would call me and ask me, how are you doing? It felt like an insurance agent was calling me. It was really annoying. They always called when I was on deadline. I'm not sure who told them that you should call a journalist at 5 o'clock and say, how are you doing? I'm fucking fine. You know? When the executive editor called me into his office after I had gotten back from Iraq and told me about this thing and said, it's perfectly anonymous, you don't have to, nobody will ever know if you need help, but if you want to come talk to me. And I told him that I had seen, because he said, you've seen dead bodies. And I told him that I had actually seen a lot more violence in terms of dead bodies in Haiti, where he had sent me many more times than he sent me to Iraq. So I think it's also important to understand what your people are seeing in places. Sometimes places like Haiti can be really, really dangerous and really scary. And he was just terribly surprised that Haiti was that bad. I don't know which story of mine he hadn't read about Haiti, but Haiti was pretty bad. No, but not Iraq and Afghanistan are horrible, dangerous, traumatic places to be. And terribly important stories that we need to tell. But there are also other places that you may send your people and realize that that may be very traumatic for them as well.
One of the things I'll back up what she and everybody else has said about Centurion. It's really good to get some kind of first responder training if you don't have Centurion available to you as far as the first aid goes. But one of the things I think was nice with the AP, especially during the invasion in Iraq, was that there was somebody there. There was somebody from management, somebody on the desk. They wanted us to call in every day to make sure that we were still alive. And just that knowledge, or just, knowing that somebody was there that cared about you, just wondering where you were or how you were doing. And even if you just had a quick 5-minute conversation with them on the sat phone, it was nice, it was comforting. Or if you had a conversation with them on instant message. As the war drew on and you would go to embeds and suddenly it wasn't the big invasion anymore, that support kind of dropped off a bit. And so it was more up to me to kind of find people to talk to. And so now whenever I have colleagues that are over there, what I try to do is if, say, a colleague of mine is embedded somewhere and I know she's by herself, she doesn't have APTN or a writer with her, I'll say, hey, my instant message is on 24/7 just for you. Okay, you can wake me up anytime. I don't care. I'll have the volume turned up. And if you want to ping me, ping me. And she did when she went to Libya. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I was in an NCAA tournament. I was sound asleep. But I heard the bring go off on my cell phone. And I got online and she was telling me about the plane she just saw crash that she got a picture of. And, you may not even talk about the things that they just saw or the things they're experiencing. It can just be, just chatter. But it's a very comforting thing to be talking to somebody who's in a safe place. I don't know why that is, but for me it feels good, and for her it felt good, and I think it was the first time anybody had reached out to her to let her know. I'm not a manager, but if in your newsrooms, if you're a manager and you can do that, that's great. Or if you can find people who will volunteer to do that, to be available, I think that's helpful. They may not ever call you, but just the thought that there's somebody there, I think is extremely helpful. Also, what Jackie was saying about the assignments that she didn't want to do when she came back, I got sent to a red carpet rope line for Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen's newest movie, New York Minute. That was, yeah, it was a really interesting experience because the real paparazzi is the one who do just red carpets. They were behind me and they were screaming and yelling and pushing at each other and calling each other's names, and they're about ready to get into a fist fight. And the last time I heard people screaming like that was at a suicide bombing in Erbil, Iraq, and I almost walked off the assignment. I couldn't handle it. I just almost just left, and I just made myself stay. And finally, after getting pushed up against the barrier, I don't know how many times, to the point where I thought I wasn't going to be able to breathe, I turned around, and these guys were like 6'6", and I just erupted on them and told them to, cut it out or whatever. And they just, they were afraid, and they stopped. And that was it. But no, you don't want to. You have to think about the assignments you're sending people to. One of the things I saw on a website one day was from somebody who worked for a lot of NGOs in places like the Sudan and Somalia, and he'd finally come home after 10 years of doing that, and he was, I don't know, selling insurance or something, sitting in a cubicle. And one of the things he said about coming back to the United States was, it's like you're coming home to a life of irrelevance. Okay, and so as management, you kind of have to think about that. There is a balance in life where these stories need to be done here. We have to cover the basketball games. We have to cover, the parades. But think about where this person was in respect to those stories, and bring them down incrementally. Eventually, it'll be fun again to cover the parade, but maybe not right now. Think about, giving them different assignments so that they're still up at this level, but maybe a little at a time at their own pace. They don't mind, going to the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade again, or, the high school basketball game, whatever it is that needs to be done. Eventually, they'll come around to that. So, and if there's, and one more thing I think is important is to educate the staff that hasn't been over there. I think what I've found in some of, my colleagues is that they see you as going over there, you're trying to make a name for yourself. What they don't understand is when you're over there, you don't see your byline. You have no idea who's using your stuff, and you care, but there's no way for you to look, and your whole focus isn't on that. It's on the people around you. It's on your colleagues that you're embedded with, as well as the military guys who you're covering or the civilians who you're covering. And it's getting the story. Suddenly, it's not competition anymore. It's more about getting the story out, and nobody really sees that except for you while you're out there. And when you come home and you're dealing with these issues, whether it be PTSD or just adjusting to life back home, the people on your staff around you kind of need to understand that, and not get on your case just because they're resentful or they don't like the attention you got for something. And I think it's important for management to find a way to they don't have to have a staff meeting and gather everybody around. That can just be done subtly, just to give everybody an idea of, look, this person's been through a lot, or these people who are coming back home have been through a lot. Let's treat them with some respect, and not get caught up in what it looks like to you.
Can we cheer for you?
Okay, one question I'd like to ask is, we've talked this morning about people not seeking help if they have post-traumatic stress symptoms because there's a stigma. So I'd like to ask you all to comment about that. But also, one of the things I hear from reporters is, why should I complain? I volunteered to go. I didn't have to actually be in combat the way some people did. So it's like, why should I complain? It'll just be whining. So how do you all respond to that?
Jackie and I have talked about this. When Jackie and I first met on Facebook, actually, we were talking about journalists and PTS, and at what point do you say, Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think she and I agree. I'm sorry, this isn't going to be very coherent, but she and I agree that we have both been in situations where people come back from maybe a couple of days and they're like, oh, woe is me, this is terrible. And we both also recognize that different people have different level of tolerance when it comes to stress and post-traumatic stress. So I'm not judging here, but I mean, it is difficult, I think, to talk about. I tried to talk to several of my colleagues who have been through a lot and to get some of their ideas and thoughts as I headed into this panel so I could talk to you in a more educated way and with doing some reporting. And the responses were very varied, and these are good friends, but they just did not want to talk about it, and I felt invasive even asking them about it. So, I mean, my heart goes out to them. I mean, I don't think that there's enough of a support system for journalists. If you think about what the military goes through, Mike's unit came home and they had 12 mandatory days of reintegration. What do we have? I mean, I'm lucky, very lucky, that AP is giving me a little bit of time off before I start back at work. Not all news organizations can afford that, and not all of us, you know, if I wasn't getting paid, that would be a really hard thing. To pay my mortgage and to just live. But I just don't think that the news organizations are putting enough into the reintegration process and how hard it is. And I wanted to add this to the last question as well. When we talk about what you do to prepare and what you do when you come back, we're missing out a big piece, and that's how you survive and how you process it when you're in theater. Because there are times that speaking personally, there were times I really needed to talk to somebody, and I was alone. You know, I mean, most of the people who were around me didn't speak English, and I wouldn't have told them my stuff anyway because they technically worked for me. So, I mean, I really needed support when I was in Iraq this year, and again, you know, I think AP did the best it could, but resources are tight, and exactly what were they supposed to do? And so I thought about going and talking to a chaplain over at the embassy, and that didn't feel very comfortable. And I ended up talking to a woman who I regard as an older sister, and so that was helpful. But it's really hard to talk about this stuff. And I don't know, I don't really have any good solutions, but I certainly think that as we all work in newsrooms together, that kind of awareness that others have talked about is a big, big piece of that. Sorry, I know that wasn't very coherent, but...
No, that was fine.
I think one thing that's very important is that time off. That was mandatory at Knight Ridder. I was not allowed to go back to work for 2 weeks. And I don't think you can afford to send people into combat if you don't have enough money to give them some time off. And that was only after a 6-week tour of duty. But that was just mandatory where I was. And the same thing when I came back from Haiti. Every time I had to take time off, paid time off. I think that's very important.
I think that that if you ignore stigma, you do it at your peril. I think stigma is very powerful. I've seen it shut down discussion.
Yeah.
I've seen it shame individuals. And I think the way to address that, you do need sensitive news managers, individuals who understand their journalists, who can reach out in a confidential way and be a conduit to the journalists getting the necessary therapy. I've also found that many journalists are deeply suspicious of their employer assistance program. And I think sometimes it's important to have some distance between the EAP and the journalist. And that's why some organizations, Associated Press, CNN, actually have outside therapists available to journalists. The whole issue of how do you come back to a society where life seems trivial, I think is an enormous issue. And I just want to report something. James Natchui, the great photographer, told me a story. He said early on in his career, he would come back to North America and feel very angry at the way people were leading their lives and somehow regarded as quite trivial. And then he started to realize that it's far better to worry about the taxi being late or the washing machine being broken than to actually worry whether you're going to get up and survive the day. And I think it involves a switch in your cognitive construct to think that way, that there might be many things in our lives that are trivial and mundane, etc. But if those are going to be the focus of your worries, well, it's perhaps healthier than to one of your children going to come back from school alive. So he that was a kind of strategy that he introduced to help him make this very difficult transition back to civil society. And what I found is if you don't make that transition back, it can be quite ruinous for relationships. That's when they really do suffer as well. So, I mean, there are multiple perils along the way. That there's perils out in the field, but to minimizing the return is also a major challenge.
I was going to just add that unlike other first responders, journalists and war correspondents, unless they do have colleagues in the field, they're more like lone wolves. They don't have a sense of community. I mean, we heard Colonel Jason talk about how important it is to have a built-in peer group, not necessarily a formal debriefing after battle or after a hostile situation, but to be able to talk to your peers, to your colleagues. And as we're just hearing today, very often, whether it's Laura talking or Jackie talking or others, you may not even have one person as a journalist whom you can trust and whom you can talk to. And that's different than any other first responder. And I think that's, I'm preaching to the choir here when I look over at Anthony, because he studied this. And not only that, but after events like Haiti, I know by talking to people at CNN how Anthony was brought in to hold forums with dozens and dozens and dozens of the employees. That's not typically done in newsrooms. It wasn't a mass debriefing, but it was an educational session, for lack of a better word, if I'm correct. And so those are things that I think when you talk about management, we're talking about a culture change. We're talking about not doing things the way that things have been done. And of course, immediately you get thrown up, well, you know, you're living in Never Never Land if you think things are going to change. But they are in different settings. Admittedly, CNN is not like a small newsroom or a medium-sized newsroom, but those are the types of, I think, culture changes that need to be thought of.
It's kind of funny. Anthony mentioned the employee assistance programs and how people don't trust them. When I came back from the invasion, they said, if you want to see the psychologist, and we called him the company psychologist because he literally would come in and observe the newsroom. And I don't know what the point of that was, but they paid him for it. I think they were all, it was kind of a strange deal, but I saw him and I got the bills, and I was supposed to hand the bills off to the editor's secretary. And I decided I didn't want to do that, and so I never passed those bills on. I just paid them myself. I didn't want them to know. I mean, I asked for that job. You know, I campaigned for it. I wanted to do it. It was something that I thought would be meaningful, and covering war and particularly covering the troops both over there and back here, and writing about what they're going through and their families has become the most meaningful work that I've ever done. It will be the most meaningful work probably that I ever do. And I can't complain about it. Whatever my problems are, I'm not going to go too much into depth with anyone in that newsroom. Most of those people I don't even know anymore. I mean, there are only a few senior people left. When I come back, I only know a few of them. They say hello, we shake hands, they say welcome back, and most people don't even notice I'm there. And I'll bet that's the way it is in most big city newspapers. I'll just bet. You know, I always keep going back to talking to people who've been there. So after coming back from a tour I did in 2004, which was a pretty rough one. It was in the summer of 2004. I came back and I bought a new car, and I took a vacation by myself, and went up and visited friends up in New Mexico, and I was these are old friends. The guy that I was with, he and I grew up together from like when we were 5 or 6, and I never felt so damned isolated in all my life. I couldn't really explain it. Well, then we get down to Goose Island State Park in Rockport. I put up my tent, and some dude comes over who was in Vietnam, and we start talking, and we break open a fifth of Jack Daniels and start talking some more, and it gets dark. And I realized that I'm feeling good for the first time in my vacation. I'm having a good time for the first first time in the vacation. And the reason why was because he and I understood each other. Since most people in your newsroom haven't had that experience, you're not going to have it there. You've got to find it somewhere else. And I'm repeating myself about that, but I'm sure of it.
What I'm not hearing any of you say is anything about family, spouses, relationships, anything like that. I mean, Colonel Jason this morning talked about when they come back, for better, for worse, whatever. First thing is hugging the family, kissing the family. I'm not hearing any of you talk about any of that. And I mean, I don't want to be flip about it. I was going to say, are any of you in a happy, stable relationship? But, I mean, you see where I'm coming from. And please be offended. But
And maybe also ask just stable relationships with siblings, with parents,
Yeah,
with friends.
family.
Yeah. So.
yeah, I mean, it doesn't. Yeah, with family, whether it's your own immediate family or your siblings and parents or whatever, address that.
Or the family you've chosen for yourself.
I'll talk about friends first, because when I my first deployment to Iraq, I could feel on the way home, all of a sudden, there was somebody that was going to be meeting me at the airport, and all of a sudden, I didn't want to meet this person. This was my best friend, and all of a sudden, not that I didn't want anything to do with her, but I felt this change. And when I had left, she had how old was he? Maybe 2 or 3, less than a year old. She had an 8-month-old child. And when I had last left them, he was at that age where they still sleep a lot and they don't really move around much. And when I got to the airport, oh my God, he was running all over the place, and I just felt like I missed something. And things weren't quite the same between she and I for the longest time, but she's one of those people who's very understanding. Knows that I'm kind of an introvert and to just kind of leave me. And so you really need understanding people around. But then there were people who I had friendships with who I never spoke with again because we just couldn't relate anymore. Things that we thought were funny, I suddenly didn't think they were funny anymore. And so as I continued to deploy, I found that, I like to journal, and that's my way of venting a little bit. So I would share my journals with some of my friends, some chosen people. And it was a way of actually talking to somebody, but at the same time, it was also letting them know where I was, so that when I got home, there wasn't suddenly this gap. And so they could understand what I had experienced and what I'd seen, and there wasn't this sort of a dead space between us of, well, what has she been through and what has she seen and what's going on. They already knew. So they knew to either leave me alone and how long it was going to take for me to go off and go camping for a month by myself or whatever I needed to just readjust and decompress. And because of that, I was able to at least maintain some relationships. They were able to grow. My last deployment to Afghanistan, I was doing a video on a battalion chaplain. And we were just sitting around. He was writing, he was writing a note to somebody, and a young soldier came in, a young private, he's probably about 20 years old, who had watched his buddy get blown up stepping on an IED a couple of days ago, and he came in to talk to the chaplain. And it turns out he had just gotten married before he deployed, and the chaplain kept asking, so, you're married, have you talked to your wife? And I just kept thinking to myself, I'm like, you've got to write her, you've got to tell her. She doesn't even have to respond, she just needs to know where you are when you get back home. And I think that's a lot of I think a lot of the problems, young military guys or even women face is that they don't necessarily communicate those things to their spouses or their girlfriends or boyfriends while they're gone, and then there is a gap when they get home, and it's the same for us, whether it's friends or family or whoever.
Okay. I am in a very happy and stable relationship because, but in a strange, kind of funny way, I got back from Iraq about a week before my husband flew in from Afghanistan. So whatever issues we have had, we have kind of been dealing with them together, and we've kind of insulated ourselves as a team, as a unit, as we go through this reintegration process, and it's been very comforting. I remember when I came back about a year ago, it was really different because I had all of these rage issues, you know, people who would just talk about the new bar opening down the street or whatever, and I would go into the newsroom and see some of my best friends, and, you know, they didn't even ask about Iraq. They didn't even care, you know. It was just like, oh, I broke this story and that story, and it was all me, and I just kind of sat there, and I'm like, I have no connection here whatsoever. But, you know, when my husband came home, we have been stronger, I think, ever than we have been in our marriage, and that's been wonderful. Now, there have been some very needy family members who have been calling at inopportune times, I would say, and I kind of feel for them, to be honest with you, because they don't know how to act either. I mean, all they know is that they're getting their daughter home or their sister home or their son home, and so they just can't wait to talk and give you all of their drama. And, you know, there have been times where we've had to say, look, this just isn't an appropriate time. Like, I'm not ready to hear this. I'll call you back or whatever. So that's been, I mean, probably the bigger stressor than the marriage. The marriage has been fantastic.
Lindsay Addario wrote a piece for the New York Times Lens blog last year, or actually right after she was released after being kidnapped in Libya, and it was such an honest piece. And I'm not going to quote it exactly, but she was talking about how difficult it is for war correspondents and foreign correspondents to maintain relationships because you're always leaving, and that is not a good recipe for a relationship. And it was such an honest piece, and I think that you know, many correspondents related to it in some way, because the most difficult thing, I think, and this is whether you're civilian journalists or military, is that, and I talk to family members a lot who are welcoming service members home, that the person who goes to war never ever comes home. Somebody else comes home instead. And I think that's a message to a newsroom as well as to family and to significant relationships, that because I think that war does change you in such dramatic ways, some of them very good, and some of them just changes. And so it is. I have friendships as well that never recovered from, have never recovered. And my circle closed, and it did not reopen when this different human being came home from war in 2005. I mean, I was quite altered, and people didn't know how to deal with me, and you know, I lost friendships over that and significant relationships. My family calls it and I think, Julie, you might have said this, there's the war you survive, and then there's the war, it can be the war when you come home. And I think for my family, they were more affected by the war of me coming home and trying to exist again here than they were, as scared as they were about the things that I was going through in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were more frightened by the war that I went through when I came home. And are very, very happy that that I am healthy today, because you know, I put them through hell when I first came home from Iraq. And so I think that, you know, I'm glad you asked the question. I'm happy for Laura and for Susanna and for Sig, and for you know, I think it's good when people find stable relationships or are in happy relationships. But the fact is, a lot of war correspondents are they have consequences on their personal relationships as a result of being there. And I think we all know people who have, and so I think it's a good, honest discussion to have.
And I should say that I was, you know, I left a husband in Bosnia, just picked up and left him there, and threw out my boyfriend when I got back from Iraq. The fact that I'm in a stable relationship now is because I am no longer a war correspondent. I couldn't have done it then. I came home too shattered to maintain a relationship at that point.
You know, I'm conscious that I'm sitting at a table with people with enormous practical experience, and I sit in an office far away and kind of observe people. But there's some powerful truths that you can get from from behavioral science. One is that good relationships are enormously protective in terms of one's psychological well-being. It's a finding that's replicated time and time again. If you're in a good relationship, it helps you not just with conditions like depression and PTSD, but even with major mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So you can't say enough good things about good relationships. The other observation that I was really struck hearing how you related to your partner coming home from Afghanistan. Geneticists speak about something called assortative mating, which basically is like attracts alike. You find people of similar temperament to yourself because that makes for a healthier relationship. It's very difficult when you don't have that kind of temperamental matching, because on the one hand, you can have a person who's living this very adventurous lifestyle, flying off. You've got a partner who's can't relate to that at all, who's kind of wired differently. That can be very destructive in terms of relationships. And you do find, it's the old adage, birds of a feather flock together. People do find one another matched on temperament. And that can be very supportive if you're able to sustain it. My final comment is that you're quite right, that the rates of separation and divorce are very high in this profession. And when I kept on going over demographic matching in my presentation, it's because you want to match people in terms of marital because it's so important protectively. But we have a great challenge. When we study a group of frontline correspondents, it's difficult to match that group with another group of domestic correspondents on the marital question because so many frontline journalists are single or separated. So we run into that very real challenge.
Well, it's a well-known truth with people who know me that I had a difficult marriage, even probably before I went to Iraq the first time. But after that, it got a lot worse. Now, people would always tell you, you're not going to know how you change. You're not going to see it. And so you don't. After I went through all that, I'll say that I pretty much figured that was it. I fought tooth and nail to keep my house. I figured that's the least I could get out of that mess, and I did. And it's a nice house, and it's been much nicer since my girlfriend and I have moved in together. She actually is a PTSD expert, and she's very bright and cheerful, and so in the question you asked, stable relationship, yeah, but I'm lucky. I didn't expect to have another one. I didn't want another one. I sat there and thought, it'll be hell freezes over when I trust someone again. And I'll never shag my financial ass the way I did on that one because it cost me. Trust is one of the, maybe, I don't know what your studies show about trust, but I'll bet war correspondents have a hard time trusting people. They're nervous as hell about it. And I don't know. I got lucky in this case. I can imagine a lot of other people don't. I remember reading about Neil Sheehan and how he just became a recluse. And that book he wrote, A Bright and Shining Light, was probably the single best book I've ever read. Just brilliantly done, and yet he paid such a high price for the work that he did. And I don't think no matter what kind of a body of work you amass, it's worth that. We all walk on our own path and come back and hope that it works out. But I think you have to want it too. I mean, at a point, I finally decided, yeah, I would like to have it. And you're right. Good relationships are very protective.
Okay, this is going to be an oversimplification, but in talking with each of you before this conference, you all talked about how covering violent events had changed you. So, and we've touched on this a little bit, but you can even do like, it changed me for the better this way, it changed me for the worse this way. Can you tell us how it changed you personally and professionally? How do you think about reporting differently now than you used to?
I remember when I was on book tour, I would talk a lot about Fallujah and how I would wear my helmet over my face, so because we were getting mortared so badly, that if I was killed, at least my mother would be able to identify my body by my face, and I was talking about this as I am now, very nonchalantly, because it was my reality, and I'm not really affected by it, I don't think. And somebody, oh, you poor thing. And I said, what do you mean, poor thing? What a great way to live, thinking that any moment can be your last. And so for me, that is the positive thing that has come from covering war and seeing the inhumanity that I've seen, is that I don't take anything for granted. I mean, I don't. And the moment I stop, I have to remind myself, I put myself back in some of the miserable places that I've been and have seen. I put myself back in a cafe in Baghdad, in particularly, where 200 people were obliterated by a suicide bomber, and to remind myself why I'm grateful. And so I think that it's changed me in that I'm very grateful. I also, having survived some of the crap that I went through when I came home, I live my life very differently as a result, and I don't regret any of my path, because I think I'm a better person for it. Other people might look at it and say it's a negative. You know, I ultimately left my job at the Washington Post and found my way back to Iraq as a freelancer. But I don't regret that, because I think that it's, you know, there's a lot of joy in a war zone as well, and I think I found that very simply.
It's interesting. That's a great question. It really is. I'll say that the best 2 months of my life were not when I was 17 in Rockport partying my ass off, and I had fun. And that's a little coastal town along Texas. The best 2 months of my life was when I was in the desert with the close air support team that I was with for the entire invasion. I learned how to live. That's absolutely correct. I was just so deeply involved in my work and producing and doing what I had always thought I could do. And then, you know, it was real. I mean, people were getting killed around us. There were bodies all the way up the road to Baghdad. And it gives you perspective. What you mentioned about New Orleans, that's the worst thing I've ever seen. Baghdad, when it fell, was a better town than New Orleans after Katrina. And so it changed me by making me more, I guess, engaged with the moment. And living in the moment is intensely liberating. The awareness that you could die at any moment, even doing something as simple as going to the bathroom in the desert, which you don't need to go too deeply into, but it kind of brings a sense of being humble to yourself, and it kind of also lets you know, wow, you're living. You come home and you don't even think much about it. You have this illusion of safety about yourself, which isn't true. I mean, I was walking down the street earlier, going back to the hotel on my cell phone, and I thought, you're really an idiot. Somebody could just run over you in this town, and it would just happen like that. And you kind of walk in that bubble of feeling safe. So that's how it changed me. I really got to be. I would focus on the moment. I do a much better job of having fun. And I guess maybe I'm not as afraid of dying as I was. That's hard to explain, but I think there's some truth to that.
I know when I came home from Columbia, I was the police reporter at the Miami Herald. I mean, I had Edna Buchanan's job. It was the coolest thing on earth. It was just amazing. But I also was very reckless. I spent far too much time in very dangerous places in Miami because I felt bulletproof. How bad could it be? You know, it's not the demilitarized zone in Colombia. And I found I did the exact same thing when I came back from Haiti and the exact same thing when I came back from Iraq. So that's the bad, or one of the bad things. But I think I also have a more long-term feeling that I have done very important things, risked something to do very important things that I believed in very deeply. And I don't want to bother doing crap that isn't important anymore. I'm much more careful to, yeah, today could be my last. I need to do things that matter. So that's kind of the good.
This may sound a little odd, but some of my worst days in Baghdad were the days I never even left our house or left our office, because they would be the days of massive attacks across the country. And so they would usually start with a bombing that would wake me up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, that would shake our windows, and you knew what it was. It's like a giant step. I mean, it's just this thud. And so I would roll out of bed and pull on some jeans and run up to the roof and try and see how close we were to the black plume, to see if I could see the plume, to see, was it just huge, or was it, was it close, or was it huge? I mean, we just couldn't tell until you went up and you'd see. And so then you'd run down to the newsroom and we'd put alert out. And the worst days, there'd be several dozen bombings across the country, with 60, 100, 150 killed. And it affected me in a way, it continues to affect me, where if I hear a gate slamming, or and that makes my heart race, or the phone rings and that makes my heart race, or right now we're living at Fort Stewart and there's a cannon that goes off every day at 5 o'clock, and we were driving in on post a couple of days ago, and we'd forgotten that it was almost 5 o'clock, and we were right next to the cannon, and it went off. And I was like, oh my God, we're under attack, And it actually wasn't like so much duck and cover as it was, I got to start calling people, I mean, do I have a photographer here? I mean, just the heart rate just went up immediately. Low-flying planes kind of messed me up for a while as well. And I suspect that will take some time to get over. And I mean, that's my problem. I mean, I can't ask the military to stop shooting their gun, although I'd really like it. But, I got to deal with that. And that's something I'm going to have to deal with for some time. And I'm sure sometime down the future it won't be a big issue anymore. And so that is how it has changed me personally and professionally, because doing what we do, I mean, it's really hard to ride those such steep highs. It really does something to you physically when you get kind of shaken like that, and it's not fun. But what it also did for me at the same time was being in Iraq really opened my world. I had been covering Washington for 10 years. And, if you're around here long enough, the same story comes around, same people are talking about the same issues. And I needed to break out of that. I mean, I was just stale. And I don't mean it in a flippant kind of way. I mean, my world was completely turned over. And it was in all a good way. I mean, I am a much better reporter than I was when I left, but I'm a much better person than I was when I left. I listen now, I mean, so many people, it's just all me, and it just taught me to listen, and it just taught me to appreciate silence, and it taught me to appreciate, the stories that really interesting people have, and everybody's got one. Every person has an interesting story, and I will just never regret the time that I was there, and I hope to go back someday, and I hope it goes along, I hope it improves.
I just wanted to make a point about what we're hearing. Kate McMahon is the head of the DART Center in Australia, and she studied post-traumatic growth. That isn't a term that we've heard at all today, but what you're hearing, what you just heard from Laura, is an example of that. It doesn't mean that there's an absence of post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic disorder, but there can be, and there is, post-traumatic growth that comes out of difficult situations. So,
I think covering conflict helped me put a lot of things in perspective. in terms of, coming home and having to cover things that are maybe irrelevant. And at some point, at first it made me very kind of angry. I didn't want to do these things. What's important about, that story over there? I've just been to a war. And at some point I realized this is reality for people here. And just because it's, not a war doesn't make it any less important. It's still, it all goes back to community journalism. And so it's still their child, their neighbor. They'll probably never ever go to a war zone or any kind of an experience like Haiti. I was there surrounded by death, stepping over dead bodies. They'll never personally experience that themselves, but that doesn't make their reality at home any less important. You still have to cover those things, and it took me a while to realize that. And once I began to realize that and accept that, it made me a better journalist, coming home and covering their stories, putting myself back into their shoes, and kind of being able to go back and forth. And at the same time, made me realize that, gosh, this is actually a good place to be. Because what if the entire world were at war? We would never have any place nice to think about that you could call home, that you could come to, that was comforting. The people who are in countries that are at war have nothing to look to grow into, to become. And so I think in that respect, it made me better as a journalist, at least, and personally. It's hard for me to sometimes separate out my personal from my professional, because it seems like that's all I ever do is work. And I hate calling it work. It's just there for, purposes of conversation. But it made me realize, why do I like sports so much? Why do I like covering sports so much? Well, because it's a celebration of life instead of the destruction of it. And that's what allows me to kind of jump back and forth from, Haiti to the Super Bowl to Vancouver to Afghanistan, and the Belmont Stakes was thrown in there somewhere, and then to the World Cup, and not go entirely crazy. It was an adjustment, but you have to realize, well, people are having fun. Yes, people are dying, but the people who are in countries that are dying they need something to look to. And you still need to cover those things.
For those of you who've been downrange, how has your war reporting shaped or changed your views of the military? In other words, what did you think about the military before you became a war correspondent? What do you think today?
You know what Ernie Pyle said? He wrote, before he became a war correspondent, he said, God, I'm glad I'm not having to cover the Army. I hate the Army. And I never hated it, but I didn't really understand it very well. And I think the experiences in general given me an appreciation of what their training is all about. When I come home, for example, and I'm covering medics running in their lanes at Camp Bullis, I actually have a really good understanding of what they're doing. And since I've actually had to do a triage myself at Centurion, and me and the photographer did a terrible job of doing it, we did everything right, but we got the wrong guy. The guy who had 3 different injuries and was dying was the one we ignored.
Oh yeah, I can do that too.
And so we told our guys that we had to have been their worst students in the history of Centurion. But you actually get a sense of why they're doing certain things. And so as a reporter who covers the military, I have a much better understanding of what they're doing. For example, you go over, I had this conversation with one of the guys I was with during the invasion, and I said, you know, you used to have a really thick mustache when we were over in the invasion, but, you know, nobody wears them back home, and the reason why is because the regulations on wearing facial hair are so precise that it's more of a hassle to do it than it is to try to grow it. And so there's a lot of little stuff that goes into it, but it actually is valuable to you if you do what I'm doing for a living. Maybe I'll just stop there. That makes the most sense.
I covered the Pentagon before I went to Iraq, and covering the Pentagon was very similar to covering the Justice Department or the Homeland Security Department, which I'd done before, in the way that it was kind of a bureaucracy. I mean, it was kind of, you know, a bunch of people running around a building and doing their things. And going downrange when the troops were there, what it did is it made the military real to me, and it made the soldiers real to me, and they became actual people and faces with stories, as opposed to just policies and white papers and press conferences that I'd become accustomed to. And it really went both ways. I mean, I want to be careful here. I don't want to sound like I'm judgmental about the military one way or the other, but I mean, I got to know I once had a sergeant yell at me. We were getting on an MRAP ready to go out one morning, and he, you know, I mean, I was just like, hi, I'm here, and his commanders had told him I was coming, and it was all fine, and I thought it was fine, and he kind of grabbed me by the collar, and he's like, if you write one expletive, you know, bad word about me, you know, I will come find you. I will come hunt you down, and I will come find you. And I'm like, all right, you know, Gongadin had a little too much coffee this morning, you know, like, chill out. And on the other hand, like, some of the people, the Joes were hilarious. I have an iPod playlist of some of the dumbest songs that I've ever heard. Like, I was out on the Iranian border, and the guys were all playing Ninja Rap by Vanilla Ice, you know? I mean, which was terrible when it first came out, but, you know, and it didn't get any better over the years. But it just cracks me up, and I will always think of them when I play that playlist, and I will think of them fondly. And they just have some of the wittiest repertoire, great jokes. I had some really nice experiences with some of the people that I met downrange. You know, so I think it just goes both ways. And what meeting them, it just made them real to me. And it was great to actually get to meet some of the younger people, or the people who actually did the work, as opposed to, again, the bureaucrats and the managers and the commanders who were up here. And, you know, it really put the face on the story for me and made a huge difference.
I think covering the military in Iraq and Afghanistan for me was, like Laura said, covering, to some extent, covering a beat, like any other beat that I've covered. You know, my father was a Vietnam veteran, so I wasn't sympathetic or not sympathetic, unsympathetic before I went. I had somewhat of an understanding from him about covering war, but you know, I think there's probably more made of the tension between the military and journalists than actually exists in a combat situation. I don't really know why that is. I haven't studied it. I'm not an expert on it. My experience was always that if I, you know, when I was with a unit and I covered them as, you know, fairly and objectively as I could, they understood I had a job to do, they had a job to do, and we didn't really have any issues. I mean, there were, in any beat I've had, whether it was, you know, I was a business reporter, was it covering the SEC or covering, you know, county government, there are always, you know, jerks, and there are always, you know, good sources, and I found that the case to be in the military itself. So, you know, I don't think it changed my impression of the military, other than to have a deeper understanding of the military, which is the point of, you know, being an embedded reporter is to cover that side. I mean, I think it's important to have journalists in a combat situation, because you don't want the military to tell you how the war is going, and you don't want the government to tell you how the war is going. That's why we're there. We're supposed to be observing and telling people who have a stake how things are really going. And so if there are tensions because there's not always an incentive on the part of the military to be completely forthright about what is happening. But, you know, having a journalist embedded with you is much more risky venture for the military than it is for the journalist, because, you know, first of all, every soldier and Marine has a cell phone, and but you're there and you observe things as they are happening, and that's a huge risk for the military when they invite a journalist along on a military operation. But I'm now rambling, so I'm going to stop.
There's one thing that I think it has changed for me. I also teach at a university, Barry University, and I teach veterans. And there's a very interesting stat that I saw recently with something Jackie and I did. There were, I believe it was 34,000 veterans using the GI Bill in college in 2009, and there were 550,000 in 2011. And having had some experiences with the military, but also just having been to Baghdad, I think helps me relate to my veteran students better. And I think they sometimes trust me when they may not trust other professors. And I think it's important to have educators who, can be trusted by veterans.
I think my coverage, my embeds and my coverage of the military actually helped humanize the military for me. I never hated them. I think I just didn't have an opinion. I didn't know what to think. You watch your movies, you see your stereotypes, and that was pretty much my impression. But you suddenly realize that this 19-year-old, he may be the best trained soldier in the world, but he's still a 19-year-old. And the MRAP that we're driving down the road in the middle of Afghanistan, that move he just pulled was not military training. That was his 19-year-old instinct who's going to get us killed because he just feels the need to, his impulse to swerve a certain way or drive on the dirt a certain way. So it really brought home to me, who these people were, and I could see the fear in their eyes, in certain situations they were in. And at the same time, I have these memories where I'm just having a simple conversation with a platoon sergeant, and I start asking him about his family, and his eyes just lit up like it was Christmas when he started talking about his wife and his 2-year-old daughter at home. And you could just see that, the love, and, he was going home in a month and a half, and that was the thing he wanted most, was to see his family. That's probably helped me cover them better there. I haven't been able to do much coverage of them at home, but as I progress into doing that, I'm sure it will help a lot. Like you said, it helps you understand your students a lot better, and they're a lot more open to you because of that.
Okay, well, I think what we'll do now is open it up, and we still have some speakers from earlier panels in the back, so if we can find microphones. Journalists, you can ask questions. These panelists are the ones who remain. Sebastian, Zach's bringing you a microphone.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to, it's maybe a question we can't answer, but what do we do to help freelancers? Freelancers are an essential part to every news organization. I am a freelancer. I live in Iraq. Unfortunately, I don't have enough money to have my couch sent over. When I did my hazardous environment training course, the Rory Peck Trust in the UK paid for 3/4 of it. I still had to pay £450, which is an awful lot of money if you have to pay out of your own pocket. I can't take a week off and charge it to the company. Yeah, and not just about me. The slide that we showed, that was the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for photography. That was the AP. And that was the AP's Iraqi photographers. Who helps those guys? Who helps, the Iraqi deaths, journalist deaths, that statistic? The vast majority, it's got to be at least 90%, if not more, are the Iraqi journalists who are dying. So what do we do to help freelancers who don't have bosses, who don't have management? What do we do?
I think, first of all, thank you for raising that point. I often thought, because, when I went back to Iraq and then covered Arab Spring as a freelancer, the moment when I realized I didn't have the fortitude to be a freelancer. I was covering a very deadly riot in Oman, and I realized no one knew I was there. If I was killed, in Iraq, at least the Post would ship my body home and send my mom flowers. I was completely on my own. I was vulnerable. I didn't have health insurance. I was screwed. And I realized that I had never thanked my freelance journalist colleagues enough for what they did, and that I didn't have the courage that they had, because the Post had taken care of me for most of my war correspondent career. But you brought up a couple of funds. The Chris Hondros Fund now exists for photographers. There are funds that exist for freelance, for insurance, which is required for embeds. And so, I think that journalism organizations like the Freedom Forum and, others can do more. They do some already, but they can do more to help freelancers. Because you're right, freelancers do make an important contribution to the body of coverage that's coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan. But, I don't have an answer for that. I know that I was very fortunate because most of my time spent in the war zone was spent with the Washington Post, covered my expenses. But, I did have the experience as a freelancer for about, almost 3 years where I also, I faced those same challenges that you did. And the only thing that kept me going was reminding myself that I still had a choice. And I was doing it because I was so compelled by the story. And that's why I was there, because I wanted to be at that riot, and I was a journalist, and nobody else was in the country, and I had photos to take and tweets to tweet, and that's why I was there. And I just assumed a greater risk as a freelancer. I don't know if anyone else has any other suggestions.
I don't have suggestions, but I can just give you once again the data. We have over 350 journalists that we've looked at in a data set. About a quarter are freelancers. And they don't have more emotional distress than the non-freelancers, but they have significantly more depression. And they have a lot more physical difficulties. So their physical health is not as good. And that raises all sorts of added challenges when it comes to looking after yourself. I remember a couple of years back when I was presenting some of this data at a forum in England called the Frontline Club, which was started by a freelancer, Vaughan Smith. And he introduced me to some of his freelance colleagues, including the parents of a journalist, Roddy Scott, who had died in, I think, Chechnya. Yeah. And the parents were just telling me what it had been like for their son to work as a freelancer. I mean, they broke their heart that he just couldn't make any money from it, but he kept on going back. And so I'm very conscious of the enormous challenges that your group of journalists face.
I know that Rodney Pinder, who's the executive director of INSEE, International News Safety Institute in Brussels, the coverage of freelancers with insurance and for hostile environment training is one of the missions that INSEE is involved in terms of fundraising and so forth. So that could be an opportunity.
I don't know enough about how you get, your soliciting work, but and I'm also sorry we never met since we were both in Iraq. Okay, we'll become Facebook friends then. But I did want to, you made the distinction about the 2005 Pulitzer team, and I just wanted to make sure you're aware they are staff photographers, and I'm very proud to say that our Iraqi staff is probably the highest paid staff of journalists in Baghdad and Iraq-wide. And why is that? It's because we care about our staff, and whether they're American or Iraqi or Brits or whatever, I mean, I care very deeply about the people who worked for me, and the vast majority of them, except for 3, were full-time staffers. We had 3 stringers. We used to have more, but in the age of cutbacks, we had to let some people go. But our stringers are contracted stringers and have all rights and benefits, basically, that under Iraqi labor laws that our full-time staffers do. They're just not, they're paid by the story. They're not paid by the on salary. And, it's been hard for all of us, especially in 2009 when it looked like violence was dropping in Iraq and everything was starting to happen in Afghanistan, and everybody shifted their resources from Baghdad to Kabul. And, we had to make some hard choices and cut back some very talented people. But we have not dropped salaries. We have raised salaries. And I fully believe, since this is what I've been spending 80% of my time on for the last year, that we have taken very good care of the staffers who are with AP in Baghdad, whether they were, again, American, Iraqi, or whatever. We just do not make that distinction.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. We have worked. I've worked with one photographer in Iraq with Iraqi people were driving a car, who were translating for us. We shared, you know, we didn't initially know who they were, so we kind of were sitting there saying, God, I hope nothing bad is going to happen. But you quickly form really strong bonds with those people, and we made sure that we gave them almost every last cent we had before we left, because we knew they were maybe not going to work again for quite a while. I was lucky because I worked for a company that gave us a lot of money, and we could do that. Freelancers obviously have a much more difficult situation. The resources may not be there like that. I have a company card, so it's like magic, right? Until I have to pay it. But the relationships you form are really strong, and you want to take care of those people as much as you can. And I wish there were more resources out there for freelancers, because I think that you know, I remember the guy from Irish Times who was kidnapped, and nobody even knew he was missing until after he was freed, and when the army came in and found him. That's amazing. So you were kidnapped and nobody knew about it. That's kind of the risk you take when you do that kind of work.
I have a question. Is this working?
Yeah.
I have a question. A lot of the talk has been about war correspondence. I come from mid-sized newspaper. I don't consider myself a war correspondent, but I have been to Iraq twice, and Afghanistan, and Katrina, and so I guess when you were asked earlier about what could management do to help, one of the things that seems to really be such a powerful tool is to have a sat phone, and it's like what I would like to take away from this is like to have maybe 10 things to tell my newsroom. This is what you could do to help us when we have to, when we want to go to war to follow a story, or there's a disaster that happens and we're getting ready to go, and when we return, and what we can do personally to help with our families. 10 things that we could put our arms around to bring back to our newsroom. Any ideas?
Get a BGAN.
Get a what?
A BGAN. It's a satellite uplink, and you actually can spend a lot of money on that, but it's probably the most efficient device I know about. I had a Thrain and Thrain, which was a really bulky, big satellite phone, and I was at the beginning of the invasion. I was letting all of my medic friends use it, because I figured making friends with the medics was a smart idea. And I put it in my story, and I knew that was a mistake, because it was saying, well, the time was running short, and we were about to go to war, and so they're calling home one last time. And my boss said, the city editor, I called and checked in, and he said, "You're not the goddamn USO." And it turned out I was. They had a $30,000 satellite bill for April of 2003. So, sometimes you can't screw that pooch. It was a good trip, so nobody got too mad. But the BGAN is really good because it's reliable. You can't use it as a phone, but you can use it as a. Well, you can use it as a phone, I think.
You can get the small ones
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, and I never used it for that, because I had an old Iridium, which I would take with me, or we'd have a Roshan cell in Kabul, and they could call you. So you can do that. The cell phones in Afghanistan are really easy now, but that's a great device because you can transmit data and pictures, and it's not that expensive. So it's really a good thing to get. And body armor.
Well, there was a reporter told.
You need a mic.
There was at one of the disasters. It was in Katrina. There was a photographer. My head was splitting because I'm a coffee drinker, and he said, "Lee, he goes, I'm taking pity on you. And he gave me he gave me 3 precious cans of Starbucks. And from then on, every time I've gone anywhere, any tornado, anything, man, I bring my little Starbucks or my no-dose for the caffeine. I mean, any other tips like that you guys have that you could share with us that would be, someone said a photograph of your family. You know, somebody told me that once, and I remembered it. When I went to Afghanistan, I had these great little tiny photos of my family that helped so much. I just little things like that, if you guys can add. I mean, the coffee thing was huge. You know, the 3rd day, and your head is splitting, and you've got to report, and it's like scary to have that caffeine buzz again. Is like awesome.
I think what you can tell people when you go back, especially people who you think are going to be going to those things a lot or potentially would be, is that just go get some car camping experience and learn to do with as little as possible. Okay? I mean, if you're not a backpacker, at least go and figure out how to use, make it a habit to bring a sleeping bag with you. And I'll go on some road trips, even here in the United States, and if I think, I'm going to be going through some small towns, the motels are going to be fishy, I'm bringing a sleeping bag, I'm not even going to sleep on those sheets. That's even here at home. Maybe your newsroom could have a kit with just some kind of a good REI sleeping bag that will fit anybody in it. A body armor, maybe it's like small or medium size with nice lightweight plates. And somebody needs to do the research on what kind of body armor to get, so you're not carrying around 40 pounds on your torso, and you have to get your newsroom to commit to spending a little bit more money so you can get the lighter ones. Because sometimes movement is more important than the actual protection. That's sometimes your best protection is to be able to run. Just have some kind of what you would call a survival kit that somebody could take to a hurricane or a tornado coverage where, there won't be electricity, so there'll be a sat phone, a beacon, and a Thuraya, something to talk on and to send data with at the same time, because sat phone, the tower may be down. A small generator or a solar panel so that you could charge your phone. What do they call it? A Gorilla? I have one at home, and I can't. Solar Gorilla. And you can, it won't charge your laptop, your Mac, but it'll maintain the battery life in it, for as long as the Solar Gorilla lasts, as long as there's sunshine. So things like that. For freelancers, there are insurance companies and geos. I sign up for that just on a personal level because I do so much vacationing by myself out in the middle of nowhere. And then as far as coming home for family, I was really lucky with the AP having a director of photography who's now vice president who has conflict experience himself. He introduced me to DART. And when he became director of photography, it was very important for him to make sure that not only did his photographers get the help they needed, but it was the right kind of help. Because not all psychiatrists or psychologists, they'll say they have training in PTSD, but it's not necessarily conflict PTSD. And I think I went once to some psychologist on, I don't know, what was it, 34th Avenue, and she hadn't a clue what I was talking about. And I was having to educate her. And after about 3 sessions with her, I quit going. I was just frustrated. I said, forget it, I'll go work through it myself. And after Afghanistan, Santi introduced me to, he said, they're not on our they're not part of EAP and they're not part of our insurance network, but we've worked something out with them, so if you do want to see somebody, contact so-and-so in HR and they'll, put you in direct touch with them. So that was available if I wanted it. And that's really important if your organization has those kind of resources or if you can. I don't know, what else?
I would add, for your little kit, I would put Theraflu in there with both the daytime and the nighttime, because the nighttime will help you sleep if you can't. I would bring a scarf like this, which can become a hijab. It can become a pashmina if you're cold. You can sit on it if your butt hurts, whatever. I mean, you can do anything with it. I would get like the Idiot's Guide to Arabic or wherever it is that you're Pashtun or something, wherever you're headed, just to say a few basic words in the local language goes so far. It's amazing. I mean, most people see if you are even trying, if you're making the attempt to speak their language, they respond so gratefully. I would always bring hand wipes, like those bacterial things, because you use them for everything. and this is a little whatever, but I would travel with a pack of cigarettes and a handful of tampons, not because I smoke or whatever, but you can trade them. I mean, it's good stuff to just, if you, it's an icebreaker, you know, you can make friends, whatever, people in need. You have no idea how far that has brought me.
I'd just throw one other thing out. Military Reporters and Editors has a packing list, and you should go on it. We worked on this for some time a number of years ago, and there's just about everything in there that you can think of. And you just go to militaryreporters.org, and it'll be there. And I think the language thing is a great idea too. But you can go through and find a whole bunch of different things in there. It's a huge, really long list.
I would also say that it's very important, especially in newsrooms like yours and also like the Miami Herald, that send people in occasionally, but they have other beats, to make sure they understand the body armor. We were in Haiti for a couple weeks when one reporter who had never worn a vest before held up these things and said, "What are these, Susanna? They came with it." Those were the plates. Those were the things that were going to protect you if you got shot. But that kind of, you know, and he's an amazing writer and he knows how to wear that vest now. But that kind of training is really, really crucial.
Just a first aid kit. It doesn't have to be the fancy one. You can put one together, you know, ace bandage, Neosporin. I bring Quick Clot with me everywhere I go.
Did you take a class to learn how to use it? Because I've heard don't bother unless you take a class.
No, I just figured I'll read the instructions and figure it out. Well, just apply it and hope it works. I mean, most of the time I figured I'd be with military personnel anyway, but if the medic was busy, I'd sure like to have something on me, or if I got separated. I bring a satellite tracker, a personal locator beacon with me in case I get separated. I've never had to use it. I use it on a personal level anyway when I go backpacking, but I thought, hey, you know what? This might be a good thing to have. And at the same time, it's one of those things where you can hit the little button and you can have your editor on the email list, and they'll get your okay message from you, and they'll know where you are and if you're doing okay. And you can do that once or twice a day, however often you want. But I think, and as far as like keeping your gear clean, for photographer, even for a writer with your laptops, your recorders, I bring a makeup brush with me. I don't wear makeup, but I bring a brush with me because it's canned air runs out really quickly, but a makeup brush, you can constantly clean things with it.
Brian?
I was going to ask, and I was going to shift gears a little bit. One of the things I think a lot of journalists pride themselves on is that we're not the story. The people we're covering are the story. And I think that sometimes lends us to fall into a trap when we're covering, be it a natural disaster or any traumatic event, war as well, where we're almost afraid to seek that help because we're like, well, we're not the ones who went through it. We were just there observing it. Do you think that causes any that role we want to play as we're not the story sort of sometimes keeps us from seeking the help we need just because we like to pretend that we aren't the ones going through it?
Maybe, which is why I think that all news organizations should require their returning correspondents to go through at least one initial screening. And it doesn't have to be that those results are shared with the news organization. I mean, it's none of their business. They would say it's their business. But, there's privacy laws to keep that. And also, it would show that the news organization cares about its people. It's a big, I would think, a morale boost. Also, I'm sitting here trying to think why I have not been screened or gotten treatment, and it's just because I'm lazy, And so another thing, like if you have to do it, if your editor says, look, you can't come back to work until you send this to me, and you won't get paid if you don't come back to work, I'll probably go do it, And again, not that it would be. It sounds like there have been some miserable experiences, and then there are people who. There may be some great experiences, and then people who have no experience at all. I'm one of the people who has no experience at all in getting treated or diagnosed or even screened or talking to somebody about this. And I probably need to do it, and I probably will do it. But why I haven't done it has really little to do with, well, it's not me out there. I mean, when I'm like ducking a cover over cannon fire, I know something's twitchy, but I'll get around to it one of these days, I'm sure.
I think that there is a reluctance for many journalists to, to raise their hand because you don't want to be part of the story. I know that when I was on book tour a couple of times, people would applaud me, and it bothered me so much because I was not a veteran, and even though I honored my own work in a war zone, it unraveled me because don't applaud me because I survived, and it bothered me, but the whole purpose of having this conference is because there is an issue, and the issue is I was talking to Bruce Shapiro about it last spring. At the Dart Center, that you have, a lot of journalists now that have for 10 plus years who have been covering sustained conflict, and they have brought those problems into their newsrooms. You have some very respected journalists who cannot function anymore in their newsrooms, and so the whole point of having this conference is because we need to talk about these issues. Whether we're uncomfortable being in the spotlight or not, we need to talk about these issues because journalists, there is an impact. It's varied, obviously. I haven't studied this formally, and maybe you can help me here. But I heard this anecdotally that somebody looked at the journalists who covered the Balkans at the major news organizations, and they went through and they were rattling off the names to me, and they said, well, he's drinking himself to death in South Africa, and she committed suicide, and they went through, and these journalists no longer existed in their newsrooms. And and that doesn't mean that obviously all journalists come home and fall apart. They don't, any more than veterans. All veterans come home and fall apart, but obviously there's an issue, and I think that more journalists need to be willing to talk about it in order to remove the stigma. And also because it's important. It's important because we do not have the same support system that veterans have when we come home from war. And my plea to news organizations is we need to have that kind of system. We need to have some sort of mechanism to deal with these issues.
I would just support that. I mean, I think this is a real issue, that the point that you made now is a definite barrier to people getting help. But it's a false logic. I mean, if someone breaks a leg and they're lying in the ER and the person in the bed next to them's broken 2 legs, does this one person say, what right have I got to complain because he's broken 2 legs? And when you couch in that very concrete terms, and people can see that this is a false way of thinking and just another barrier to them getting the necessary help.
Well, on the other hand, I have to say, I spend a lot of time around wounded soldiers. I have been going in and out of BAMC since the end of the invasion, and that place is busier now than it's ever been. There are about 1,500 families and wounded soldiers there, and the people who are coming back from Afghanistan, they're more wounded than the ones who came out of Iraq. Their wounds are worse. So when I sit there and have a moment where I feel like I might feel sorry for myself, I can remember the guy that we watched have amputation surgery in Balad in 2006. I still know that guy. He's having a great life. There's a bunch of other people I've known through the years, and they're pretty tough people. So yeah, I do have kind of the attitude that I probably shouldn't complain. And on top of that, I work in a news organization that has cut back severely. And there's no money, and we've had a really serious management change over the last year. Nobody's even, if I should go back to the war zone, nobody's even going to think about how are you doing mentally. It's not going to happen, and I've just got to maintain an even strain, as they said in the right stuff. I've just got to, or as the soldiers always like to say, I've got to embrace the suck. There are days when it's not easy, but I've got my girlfriend, I've got my dog, I've got my cat, I've got my friends who've been over there, and I'm nowhere near as bad off as some people I know. There was a guy I was with on Christmas Eve last year, and somebody was playing Jingle Bells on the in the restaurant, and he said, "I remember Jingle Bells. I was listening to Jingle Bells when I was shooting up a VC nest when I was on an attack run in my Cobra." And I thought, God, you don't have any problems.
So can I actually, can I turn the question back on you for a second? I'm sorry, I don't want to, but I'm just kind of wondering, if we're colleagues in a newsroom and you say something that, you know, you think is totally innocuous and it bothers me on some level, or you're really loud on the phone or something, how would you react if I came up and said, hey, I don't really know how to say this to you, but you're really annoying me, you know? I mean, and because of some of the stuff that I'm dealing with, like, how would that even be received on your end? Because I'm thinking a lot about that right now.
Well, I probably get told that once a week anyway because I'm loud and obnoxious just in general. I mean, that it always depends on the approach. I mean, I think especially if somebody in my newsroom who had just come back from covering like the World Trade Center, you know, or had been in Afghanistan and had been subject to IEDs and stuff and said, hey, loud noises really are getting to me right now, that wouldn't bother me nearly as much as, I mean, I get, as it is, you know, copy editors who just shush you just because they think it's their job or something. So, I mean, I think it's all in the approach. I think most people would be fine if you said that. I mean...
Well, there was somebody on this panel earlier said, well, you know, when we were talking about the fact that you come home from these war zones and nothing seems relevant, you know, which is something that we have to deal with. And, you know, life has gone on here, you know, and it continues to go on. It's going to go on however we deal with it, you know. But there was a suggestion about maybe getting people together, not like in a big group hug or something, but saying, hey, you know, FYI, she may be a little dually today, you know. I mean, what do you think about that? Does something like that, would that be weird, or what's the best way to approach that issue with your colleagues?
I mean, I don't know. We were talking earlier about personal relationships, and I think that's kind of where it comes down to, because I have not deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq, but I've covered lots of death. I still do breaking news. I cover disasters a lot, and I've covered some really grisly murders where children were butchered and stuff. And that, you know, and I've had issues from that. And people I turned to were my colleagues who maybe had not even, some of them had gone through it, some of them hadn't. But it was, again, just finding people that were essentially friends as well as, you know, colleagues that I could talk to about it. I think it's just the personal relationships. I think it's harder if you've been in Iraq for 3 years. You don't have those close relationships with the colleagues that are still in the newsroom. I mean, unless you're Facebooking them every day or something. I don't know how you would maintain that. I would like to hope. I mean, I would be sensitive if somebody had been deployed, and I would know. And maybe I'm not the greatest source here because I've covered a lot of PTSD issues, so I kind of know what can set you off. But I don't know that. I think most people, if they were just given a very brief, you know, here's the issue with post-traumatic stress, and our newsroom does this. The Oklahoman was one of the big early supporters of the DART Center because it kind of started up right after April 19th, the bombing, and we had a lot of reporters who had some issues from that, and that's kind of where some of the early work from DART came out of. We have, every couple of years, the DART Center people come down and talk to the entire newsroom, and we're told not only how to deal with victims and cover victims, but also how to recognize signs in ourselves of trauma, of you know, having issues. So I do think it'd be helpful if more newsrooms did that. And it's not like, I mean, it's like an hour-long session that we do once every 2 years. And if you were hired in the last 2 years, you got to go to it. We had one this last week. So I think it'd be great if they did something like that. And I think most people would be sensitive enough if they just were told it could be an issue.
Would they come to a newsroom if you ask them?
Yeah, DART Center comes down and does it. I'm sure they fly them in. I'm sure they pay some, you know, the Oklahoman pays something to have them come down, but it's not, you know, any kind of great expense.
Okay, Jim.
By the way, I just want to throw one thing out. I'd be very surprised if a lot of people who've been to the war zone a lot really feel terribly comfortable back in their newsrooms again, because you talk about irrelevant. And I don't mean it in a negative way, but you just never are going to feel like you quite fit in there again the way you did before you left.
In our waning minutes here, I wonder if I can ask a question of some of our earlier panelists. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I was thinking of Dr. Kilpatrick or Paul Ishner, when I talk to veterans who are getting treatment for PTSD, a lot of them say they don't like the amount of drugs that are being given as part of the PTSD treatment. I'm curious if you could say anything about whether if that's been acknowledged in your circles and sort of what the trends are and the thinking on that.
Why don't you come on over so they can get you on camera?
Well, I can try to start to address it, and obviously it's a very complicated issue. I think you heard earlier that very often when people come into a clinic with the volume of people coming in, the biggest complaint I hear from veterans is I come in, I tell my life story, pour my heart out to somebody, and they say, okay, I'll see you again in 3 weeks and take these pills. They come back in 3 weeks and there's a new person. And so they start all over again. And after 3 or 4 sessions with a new person each time, and maybe changing medicines because that doctor doesn't like what the other doctor prescribed, then they just give up and they quit. And they go out and try to do it on their own. We're really struggling to say there ought to be a standardized treatment as we start, at least a basic 101 treatment for PTSD. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean medication. If the symptoms are having trouble sleeping, then maybe you work on something that helps people sleep to get a good night's refreshed sleep, and that would be a good place to start. And so I think that there's a lot of work going on that, and I think Dr. Schnur can probably talk to some of the research that's looking at some of those issues. But if the person starts to doctor shop, and this is part of our problem, and is the DoD created problem, we have our military one source that they can go to anonymously, and there's nothing that comes in the military medical record. And so if they get their prescription at a doctor outside of the military system or outside of our contracted civilian healthcare system, it doesn't show up in our system at all, so we don't know they're taking that medication. If they're in our system, the alarms will go off in the pharmacy and saying, these are some medications that could cause a problem when taken together. And so there is an issue. And I think that as we try to address that, the Marine Corps probably is most aggressive in it. And as you heard earlier, their medical care is provided by the Navy. But you know, the line leadership of the Marine Corps said, you know, we want this to stop. You know, if you take 1 pill, okay, but not 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think that this is where we're getting into multiple medications, and then we get into starting substance misuse going on to abuse. And so it is one of those circular sorts of issues we get into. And I do think that as we try to address this, we're saying what needs to be the protocol. There are great research protocols going on, but 75% of the people with PTSD have other confounding medical problems that disqualify them from these studies. So what's the study to include everybody? And that needs to be the one as we go forward and try to better understand that. Paula, do you want to talk about the research?
Well, I hope I understood your question, and I wasn't sure if it was simply whether pills would help or how we could use pills. Could you give me your question again to make sure I answer it?
A complaint I hear from veterans is they feel like when they go in for PTSD treatment, they're being heavily medicated, and so I wondered if there is if you could comment on that, and what is the talk in sort of your circles about how that might be addressed if it's felt that it's a problem?
Well, there has been conversation and action about this. I think that a few years ago now, maybe, Sonia, I mean, it really came to light that a lot of veterans in VA care were receiving a lot of medication. And the reason for that is not just because our prescribers like to prescribe drugs. It's right now we don't have the best medications. The best treatments, the most effective treatments we have are psychotherapy that take real work. Medications work, but they don't work as well. And so what we saw is increased prescribing to try to treat the residual symptoms. And
VA has taken some very significant efforts to try to dial this back so that people get medications when they want medications and that things don't just get layered on. I think I might disagree with my colleague here. Here's a little sensation. I wouldn't necessarily give people drugs to sleep, even though I have Ambien with me right now because I stayed at a hotel last night. Rather, if someone has a chronic sleep problem, I would try to use something like the cognitive behavioral interventions for sleep because the pills are not a good long-term solution, and I think many veterans don't want that, even though they may have been in that kind of place. Now, am I answering the question that you asked? Still not yet?
Give her the mic, please.
My follow-on would be sort of like what solutions might be out there for this, because and specifically the drugs I mentioned is that veterans say they get all these antidepressants and then they feel really wonked out.
Well, actually, as I was saying right now, the best psychotherapies we have are better than the best medications we have. The medications work, and they're good, and some people will respond very well. I have a bias. This is not a VA or a Dartmouth or a National Center position. Right now, given the evidence, if I had PTSD, I would get psychotherapy because it works better and it lasts longer. So I think that the answer is not to have everybody do a one-size-fits-all, to make sure that the care is very much what a given veteran or a journalist wants to have, but to really consider alternatives to medication as perhaps the first strategy, unless somebody doesn't want to talk, and in which case medication may offer an individual some help. Layering on medication's not a good idea. If they're not working, I would still turn to therapy.
I think there's a really important story that hasn't been told enough about the dangers, both in dealing with PTSD with veterans and others who mix a lot of the drugs, the class of drugs called benzodiazepines, which are like Klonopin and Xanax and Ambien, with alcohol. And I went to a conference when I was covering the military down, I think it was at Duke, talking about substance abuse issues. And that's one of the recurring themes that they were talking about is how many people are not educated well enough about mixing those drugs that they may be prescribed as a short-term solution, and then they're not doing enough, and so then they're drinking heavily on top of that, and it's a very, very dangerous combination. And so I would like to see, I mean, I don't write a lot of stories right now, but I would like to see a lot more coverage, and I think there's an education component in that, and letting people know the dangers of that.
I'll throw one thing out here. Because I follow suicides at Fort Hood very closely, I also ask a lot about deaths that happen that are mysterious, and you see quite a number of people every year who simply don't wake up. Now, I'm willing to bet that most of those are drug overdoses that probably weren't intended. I mean, among civilians, that's a huge problem. I think Texas is the single worst state for prescription drug overdoses that lead to death or hospital admissions in the ER. Because we've written so much about suicide through the years, I had to find a new angle to get the story on the front page. And the angle was the prescription drug issue, which in 2010 was finally coming to the fore. And the guy that I wrote about was given a new prescription. It was a drug that just apparently just did not work for him. He started to have visions of things happening that weren't happening. And one night he was on his meds, and then he drank 18 beers. He fired his gun, jumped in the truck, the cops were called, they had a high-speed chase, and he killed himself at the gas station. So it's a huge issue. The trouble in writing about this is making it fresh in a place where you've already written a lot about it, making it appeal to your bosses. That's the trick. But that story needs to be written about a lot more. It's one of the biggest issues in Army medicine today. And they've tried to do stuff about it. They've tried to do drug testing so they can tell when somebody is taking drugs after they should have quit. They've tried to tighten up the dispensation of prescriptions, but it's still going on all the time.
We've got time for about one more question, so Alex.
We've talked today, I'm going to bring it back around to journalists and covering war zones or other traumatic events or traumatic, a lot of us have seen a lot of different things and been to a lot of different situations. But it's also very similar with like what Colonel Jason had said earlier about coming back and feeling that a lot of the news coverage seems trivial. Seems, it's like, why is the fascination with the Kardashians, et cetera, when there's so many important stories out there? I'm just wondering your own personal, and I know Jackie, you went off and became a freelancer as well. What is your personal thought on how do you deal with news executives who may say things like, the stories that you want to do, so what? Who cares? It's been 10, 11 years of war. It's a ratings downer. And I know that each of us is very passionate about what we do and what we want to cover, and that we think it matters. But how do we make news directors interested when they are cost cutting? And this is something you all deal with day in, day out.
I would say first off, whether it's war or foreign policy or whatever it is you want to write about, the first newsroom I ever worked in, a colleague said, if you want to do that story, just do it and then tell your editors that it's done, because they're not going to say no, because there's going to, at some point they will use it. It may not be on your timeline, but, who's going to say no when you've already done all this work? So I would just first do the story anyway and then say, look at me, I have all these pictures and all this. And we all know that pictures really help sell a story as well. I think fairly so. I think that there's, Julie's, and, actually Julie's a great person to talk to about how the pictures are the story as many times, if not more times, than the actual copy or I don't know what kind of medium you work in. But I used to have to fight with my editors all the time and be like, people died here today in Iraq, what do you mean this isn't top of the digest? And, sometimes you just have to do the story anyway and just know that it's not going to be leading the paper. And sometimes you lose your battle, but the trick is always in trying to win the war. And so maybe you don't do that story, but maybe you wrap it into another story. Maybe you sit on it for a couple of weeks and find another hook to do it with. Maybe you tell your story, you tell your boss, well, New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN just did this, and so we look really stupid if we don't, so that kind of thing. There's all sorts of ways to, make the broccoli taste good. So not that your story is broccoli, but that's what you're feeding the broccoli to the editor. And so, you know how to do it. It is very frustrating to think about. I think there was something major happening in Iraq at the time that everybody was fixated over what Tom Cruise was going to do for his 50th birthday because Katie had just left him or something. Oh, and I was like, really? But, you live with it, and that's the nature of what we do. And so you figure out a way, and I know you will.
Yeah, I would add to that the tension in newsrooms now, which is focused on getting hits on your website, that's complicating matters tremendously.
So just get all of your friends to go hit your story, to pop it up. I know it's so true, Sig.
Yes.
They all look at what's leading Yahoo International or whatever. So just put a tweet or and Twitter also. If you just tweet your story link, huge. Yeah.
I got to tell you, I probably shouldn't say too much ill about my paper because they've been really good to me. I've been very fortunate to go and do what I've done, at a regional newspaper. I mean, it was stuff that national reporters do. So I've had a great career. But with that said, my girlfriend and I have a joke about the headlines that we're using on our website, which we came up with a clause that you could stick on almost all of them. Body found in trunk. The sensationalism is getting worse because there's a lot of pressure to make the web work. And now I think if you can find a way to make the web work for your story, then you've got a real advantage. So if I pitch a proposal to go back to Iraq for a 10th anniversary, we've got a whole platform of photos and stories and blogs that we did 10 years ago. And you can leverage that on the website. I have an idea going back and finding all the guys we were with and doing a story on each of them, going back to Baghdad and seeing what Baghdad is like 10 years after the fall, doing a story about how the Army, what's happened to the Army 10 years later, because the Army bore the weight of that war. What about the families? I mean, you can make a hell of a project out of it. You can get video. You can do a lot of pictures. So if you can find ways to sell it in the environment that you're working in, the values that they now hold, you've got a good shot at making your project work. But you know, if you can always get a dog in it, you can always trust me, you can sell it even more, because animal stories, for some reason, people are just crazy about them. But in all seriousness, that's what you have to do. You've got to figure out what it is your bosses want, and then find a way to sell what you're doing in a way that appeals to them, because they have legitimate reasons for what they're doing. And my bosses aren't selling the web because they think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's because their bosses in New York want it. So you're kind of stuck. That's your reality. So make it work.
I think just try to localize it, you know, put a face on it from your community, and that's probably the best way you can do it. If you're not like a large news organization like the AP that needs to be covering those stories to begin with, you know, put community journalism, put a face on it. It's going to be one of the best ways you can sell it. Create your own Kardashians at home, essentially. You know, not necessarily sensationalizing it that way, but you know, I think that's the only way you're going to be really be able to compete with that.
Local dog finds body in trunk.
Right.
I love it.
Kardashian
divorce.
Right, yes.
That's your top story of the day, right there.
Probably of the year, actually.
Well, it's time for us to wrap up, so I want to thank our panelists very much. I want to thank all the journalists who took time to come here today. I know you all are incredibly busy, so I know it was a big chunk of time for you, so thanks a lot. We're going to adjourn to the Holman Room, which is right across the marble walkway. And
Before we adjourn, I think everybody in the room owes a big round of applause to Barbara Barnett for putting this together for you.
And Tom gets $5 every time he says that. So, but thank you again for coming. And like I said, just enjoy, have a chance to talk with each other more, meet KU alums. It'll just enjoy your good time. So thanks a lot. Yeah, the reception's open now.
Where is it?
Right across the hallway. It's called Holman, Holeman Lounge.
You know, the last time we met, it was in Baghdad. We were at a